Morning. All right. Let the electrons bounce around from satellite to satellite, back down into your living rooms at home. Let me find my window. There we go. Move things over. Dr. Keith, how you doing, buddy?
Doing well today. How are you doing, Corey?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. We were just talking in the pre-show just about how the past couple of weeks have been, particularly this past week. And we wanted to start off the show in particular by taking a moment to remember our dear friend Terry Patton, who passed away last week. And I think that his passing had a fairly big effect on, well, certainly on the two of us. And I think on a lot of the people who are watching us right now. So we were chatting before the show, and we figured let's take the first few minutes to remember Terry, to celebrate his life, and to really feel how massive this guy's contributions were to the integral space as we know it today. Terry is someone who I've known for just about 20 years. He was one of the people who, when I got here back in 2003 or so, I think he came in, shortly afterwards, if he wasn't here already, but I met him shortly after that. And I've had so many experiences with the guy. I wouldn't say that Terry and I ever became super close, but we've had a lot of encounters together. We did a lot of events together. We've done a number of shows together. And we've always just had such a wonderful friendship and connection. And, Terry was always incredibly kind when I was going through everything with my daughter. He would always ask about her, which just always meant the world to me. And, another thing we were talking about beforehand is just, when I think of Terry Patton, one of the things that comes to mind first is just, this is a guy who was so good at walking his walk. You know what I mean? He didn't just sort of talk in the abstract and, get people behind these big, beautiful integral ideas. I mean, this is a guy who was really trying to express integral, not just through his art, but also in his hands. He really tried to, step into the world with an integral sense of social justice, for example. And I'll tell you one thing, he was the same guy on stage as he was off stage, which I think is always something to admire. So we're really missing Terry, and I think just feeling into the effect that losing him has had on us personally, but also just remembering all the good times that we had with him.
The thing that you said is the thing I admired the most about Terry, was he was fully committed. He was fully committed in the Adi-Da community. He was fully committed once he had an integral awakening to be a central figure in the integral wave. He's fully committed to his essentially his ministry around climate change. And that I admire that. Yeah. I mean, I've never quit my day job.
Right.
Now, I happen to really love my day job, being a therapist, but Terry dived in and continued to dive in. He and I first saw each other through our work. We saw each other on stage. We were reading each other's articles in a journal of integral theory and practice. I don't know if you ever checked out my books. I checked out Integral Life Practice. And I started listening to Beyond Awakening, his podcast. And I loved this. To this day, one of my favorite podcasts of all time is his interview with Daniel P. Brown, which I listened to probably 15 or 20 times. And I, to this day, are doing practices that Daniel talked about in that. And I developed this ambition. This is before I had much stature in the integral community. I really wanted to be on his show. So, I got a hold of him, and he generously said, sure. And we had some long conversations preparatory to that show, because he and I have different ways of addressing the world's problems. And it was wonderful. It was wide-ranging, contact. It was intimate. It was personal. As you said, same person on stage as off stage. It was a wonderful time. We did that show for Beyond Awakening, which is still on the podcast, I assume, if you ever check it out. I was more disoriented by his death than I thought I'd be, frankly. And I called up David Reardon, and he and I talked that day. And you and I just have been talking about it. And maybe it's that, there's kind of a bunch of people in their late 60s, 70s, kind of on the bottom, starting Integral when it began to that geometric expansion that it did 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so Terry died, and now and that'll happen with more of us. Ken's getting on, I'm getting on, Roger Walsh. I mean, there are generations. So God bless him, his family, and everybody. I hope everyone's doing well with it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and it's true what you say. And this is something I find myself thinking a lot about, Keith, is sort of, we had this very bright sort of generation of Integral come through.
That's right.
And it was, as you say, it was mostly guys, at the very beginning, sort of in your cohort, right? It was sort of taken up by a lot of boomers.
It was guys and a few women.
Yeah, that's right. And fortunately, we've got a few more women with us today than we did 20 years ago. So I mean, there's this thing has certainly, caught on, and sort of more and more people and more different kinds of people have selected into this Integral thing that we're doing. But when Terry passed, that was exactly sort of how it hit me, is like, oh, the Integral world feels so much smaller now without him. And this is one of the questions that I find myself asking is, as you guys, continue to age, and so do we, I'm constantly asking, like, who is sort of this next cohort? Who is the next generation of integralists who are going to take that baton and run with it? And so these are questions that I'm constantly asking myself. I'm 44 years old right now. So I'm at about the same age that a lot of you guys were when you got into, this space to begin with. And so that's something I've got my eye on. I'm actually probably going to do an episode with Ryan Olkey, maybe in a month or two, where we're asking questions like this. And one of the things I'm interested in, Keith, is just, what aspects of Integral maybe need to be interpreted a little bit differently to be made more appealing to other generations. It might be that some of the idioms, for example, that really attracted people to Ken's work, it might be that those same idioms lose a little bit of traction with other generations because they speak to a different set of life conditions and etc. So these are ongoing questions that when someone like Terry passes on, just sort of comes right back up to the surface for me. And I think we'll have an interesting series of shows over the next few months asking these questions and seeing what direction they bring us in. And the other thing I just wanted to mention is the topic of today's show, which I feel like landed in it's a very another one of these kind of synchronistic, because you mentioned you wanted to do a show today on the topic of shame and regret. Mm-hmm. And that email landed, and I was right in the middle of sort of metabolizing my response to Terry's passing. And those were two feelings that were very, very present for me, with shame and regret, mostly around the fact that, Terry, he declined very, very quickly. We've only known for about 7 months that he had this illness. And then all of a sudden at the end, it took a turn for the worse. And it was very sudden, and it was a very fast slide. And I could feel all of the regret that I had, that I didn't get an opportunity to say thank you to him for all the things I wanted to, I thought, it's such a cliche to say, but I thought I had more time. Mm-hmm. And that, I experienced that as a type of shame. I also experienced it as a type of regret that I could learn from, that I could grow from. And I could say, okay, I need to make sure that I'm able to take my own traumas out of my shadow, so that I don't turn away if someone I care deeply about is, dealing with these challenges. And the last thing I'll say about Terry, just in terms of how I'm metabolizing his passing, is for whatever reason, it's the beautiful part of it for me is that it's caused me to really, really recommit to my own spiritual practice, to my own meditation practice. And I see that in a lot of ways as sort of Terry's final lesson for me. That's just how I'm dealing with the grief. I'll be curious how others are.
You know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, when she talked about grief many years ago, nailed it. It's interesting to me how accurate her understanding. There's denial, and there's bargaining, and there's depression, and there's anger, and there's acceptance. And one of the forms of bargaining that we instinctively do is through guilt and shame. And the reason for that is our unconscious wants to go back and change the past. And it believes it can, because it does. On the upper left and the lower left, our unconscious, our shadow side can and does change the past all the time. We were talking about that before the show. And so it wants to go and change it into something that works better than what's working right now. And that this somehow answers something, that somehow answers the pain. The pain would be less if I would have told him how important the pain would have been less, and so on. And you, like with all the stages of grief, you have it happen, you be curious, you want to learn from it, as you said. And it's interesting, as you described it, the shame turned into regret. Shame and regret are very, very different. They're the same family of emotions, but regret is a more mature affect, and it's more integrative. And part of our job as an adult people is to learn how to turn shame into regret. I have one more thing to say, though, about what you said about integral.
Yeah,
Ken's always described himself as a map maker. And integral is an exquisite map of the cosmos. So I find myself a lot with high functioning people. They enter a certain territory, and I have an integral understanding of that territory. And so I'll apply aspects of the integral map to clarify what's happening at this territory, whether it's someone having a Kensho experience, somebody shifting from green to teal in a particular area, somebody having a lot of difficulty communicating with one value meme or another, someone having difficulty inhabiting one of the states that you kind of have to inhabit to be able to have vertical growth. I think Terry O'Fallon is accurate that there are certain states that you need to be able to experience in a stable fashion to be able to have vertical development. And I don't know if the integral language is the best language or the integral map is the best map, but I know that those of us that have internalized it makes it a lot easier for us to be guides. And it's made me such a better guide. And, to a large extent, change workers are guides, therapists, coaches, consultants. We're guides. And integral was the cosmology that exploded our consciousness into whatever our natural healing style is. And I think it'll be like that. Though, again, since it's include and transcend, we have figures and teachers that we associate with our experiences. And so it matters when they die. It has an effect. There is a community of people that do have this shared understanding. And Terry wanted to be a leader in that community and worked at it.
Yeah.
And accomplished that. And so we feel it.
Yep.
We feel his death.
That's beautifully said. Yeah, I find myself, the feeling that I'm left with is again, this is just how I process my own grief, but there's maybe it's part of that bargaining or whatever, but part of it is I want to do my best to honor the legacy that Terry left behind. And for me personally, the way that a legacy intersected with my own life really was around integral life practice. He helped
body, mind, spirit, in self, culture, and nature.
That's right. And Terry really helped put integral life practice on the map.
Mhm.
And for me, it feels like the very, very best way that I can honor his legacy in my life is to recommit to that piece that he gave to all of us. It wasn't only Terry, it was also Ken, it was Marco Morelli, it was, I mean, we have all sorts of people who've worked really hard to get, to turn integral life practice into the powerful vehicle of transformation that it is.
Mhm.
But man, Terry was just right there at the vanguard the entire time. And so that's my way of honoring Terry, is just, I want to allow his fullest legacy into my life and into my sort of my volitional center, so I find myself choosing practice much more easily these days. And some of the obstacles that I experienced around choosing to practice have diminished a little bit. And I thank Terry for that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I remember during the integral living room, Terry and Jeff and Diane and I were all hanging out. I wasn't a leader in that, but I was hanging out with them. And there's just a certain kind of energy that happens when you get high frequency leaders sitting around together in the middle of a workshop that was just very relaxing and yummy, friendly. Because you're in the middle of all kinds of processes. That's one of my more pleasant memories of. So let's talk about turning shame into regret. Let's talk about.
Yeah, let's. And I was fascinated, Keith, by the blog post that you sent me. It was as usual, really well done, and we'll include it when we publish this video. It'll be right in the page, right down there. But what I found really, really fascinating was how, oftentimes I think typically human beings tend to relate to something like regret as a negative emotion, and shame also. We relate to these things
Right.
sort of, it doesn't feel like on a limbic level there's a lot of positives coming out of the experiences of shame and regret. And yet and I think, you do a really, really good job of framing sort of the positive qualities of each, and how, shame both helps us navigate socially. It's a really, really important sort of field when it comes to learning how to be with a group, right? Learning how to move
Absolutely.
with a group. It's the shame is essential there, but also regret, being able to use regret as a leverage point for growth and awakening, I think was a really, really interesting reframe. And I look forward to hearing you share that with our audience today.
About 15 years ago, I wrote a book that you can get on Amazon called The Gift of Shame. And I wrote that book because in my study of neurobiology, I came into the neurobiological research in the 2001, 2002, and was blown away by what had been done the previous 12 years. And so for about 3 or 4 years, I basically studied neuroscience, and particularly interpersonal neurobiology. In the course of my studies, realized that shame was way more of a developmental driver, and particularly in the development of the social self. It's a social emotion, and of the moral self, and also of the defenses. It was way more of a driver than anxiety or the other emotions. In that sense, Freud got it wrong. It wasn't anxiety that causes the unconscious to produce the defenses. It's shame, and the fear of shame, and perhaps anxiety about shame. So I wrote The Gift of Shame, and I stand by that. I think it's valid. And the thing that you mentioned earlier is exactly right. All emotions are important. There are pleasurable emotions and painful emotions, and there are healthy expressions of pleasurable emotions and healthy expressions of painful emotions, and unhealthy expressions of pleasurable and pain emotions. But all emotions are good. They are there to motivate us to action. That every single emotion is motivating us to do something, to take care of ourselves or to take care of the tribe. Every single one of them. And with every emotion, what do we want to do? Well, we want to first feel it, Why? Because dissociated emotion causes problems, as we all know. Let's look at the passive aggressive experiences that we've had. We want to feel the emotion. We want to acknowledge it. Yeah, I'm ashamed, or I'm guilty, or I'm angry, or I'm in a rage, or I'm sad, or I'm happy, or I'm joyful, or I'm turned on. We want to feel it. We want to acknowledge it. We want to act on it. It wants us to act, and we want to act in the service of the highest good. And then we want to let it go. I told this to a guy that worked for the Defense Department once. Defense Department is full of acronyms, right? So I said, yeah, you got to feel it. He was having difficulty with anger. He had passive aggressive wounds. He says, oh, I get it, Keith, it's fog. I went, fog? He said, yeah, feel, acknowledge, act on, and let go. I went, okay, well, that's one of those inadvertent acronyms because, I would never create an acronym called FOG.
It's better than FUBAR.
It's better than FUBAR. Well, FUBAR really is evocative, isn't it?
It is a good one.
There used to be a club nearby back when I was 22 or 23. I remember driving home from the FUBAR after, spending the night drinking beer and dancing and distinctly seeing two streetlights when I should only be seeing one.
You truly were fucked up beyond all recognition.
I was. I'm glad I didn't get pulled over. So emotions are there. There's no good or bad emotions. And shame is actually one of the most central social emotions that there is. If we don't have shame, we're psychopaths or toxic narcissists. So it's a big deal. Shame is so people give shame such a bad name, and the shame emotions, mortification, regret, embarrassment, that's all part of the same set of emotions. Basically, if our nervous system perceives us violating a value, and particularly being observed violating a value, we'll have a shame emotion. You'll just generate it. And then how we process that shame emotion will determine our moral development. It'll determine our development on the integration of defenses line. It'll determine our psychosexual and our psychosocial development. It's a big deal. Mm-hmm. So that's the nature of it. Now, we're also wired to avoid shame. It's a parasympathetic affect where we're going down into collapse. When you feel ashamed, you blush, your neck muscles and back of your neck get weak, you look down, you freeze, you're going down. And if you stay too long in that state or go too far down, you can literally die. So the nervous system doesn't like it. Now, it was arranged that when as shame evolved in us, and it's not unique to us, by the way. All mammals have shame emotions. When they're disapproved of, they go into their version of a shame emotion, and that's how one of the ways that social learning takes place among mammals. And I'll talk more about this later. There's a thing called the negativity bias in people and in mammals.
So Keith, real brief, are you saying that when a teenage girl says, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed, I could literally die, you're saying they actually could?
Well, yeah, very low probability.
Okay. I just want to make that
very tiny. We're statistically speaking, very, very, very tiny. Around being hit by lightning, maybe.
Okay. That's helpful.
But just very tiny. People don't feel shame before the age of 10 months because there's not enough of a separate sense of self. We have to experience ourself being observed violating a rule and with disapproval. Okay, that starts, interestingly, at the stage of development that the psychoanalysts called primary narcissism, which is about 1 year old. Because at that point, the kid's got nothing but positive from a good enough parent, and everything is great. But then around 10 months old, you start being able to walk. You feel yourself as a separate person from mom or dad and want to go to them for comfort sometimes. And you can experience shame emotions when you're disapproved of with a verbal or a nonverbal expression of disapproval. And between 10 and 17 months, children in this culture hear the word no every 8 minutes. So they're doing something that's violating a standard because they're being socialized. Okay. This is called the practicing play subphase of the Margaret Mahler separation and individuation stages of development. And so mom goes, no, and her voice has an edge, no, and she has this little, angry face thing. And the kid will experience a shame emotion. They'll blush, look down, they'll freeze, they'll feel bad. And then mom picks up the kid and says, I just don't want you to hit your brother or break the lamp or whatever. And within about 10 seconds, the securely attached child is back to happy, sympathetic arousal, but a little bit of social learning is taking place. If a child's growing up in a tribe, there are 50 or 60 people around doing that all the time, approving, disapproving, touching, reassuring, and so on. It's different in a nuclear family. This is why children do better with 3 or more secure attachment figures rather than just 1 or 2. That's where it starts. And that's where we learn social connectedness, social appropriateness, and so on. Around 2 years old, when we have a theory of mind, when we go, I'm a separate thinking being and you're a separate thinking being, which is around 2 or 3 that comes, we can observe ourselves. And if we observe ourselves breaking a rule, we can feel shame. And it is a developmental achievement around 4 or 5 when children will behave in a virtuous manner when no one's watching, because they're watching. Okay? And that's shame. It's a social emotion. It comes out of social interactions, and later on, it happens in our intra personal social emotions as we observe and relate with ourselves. And so that's the nature of shame. It lets us know whether we're navigating appropriately in the social universe, and it gives us this jolt of pain if we experience ourselves not functioning in that fashion. But remember, during development, we develop our capacity to experience emotion. And in the beginning, children are not aware of emotion. And as they become more aware of emotion, they're aware of one emotion at a time. Then later on, they can be aware of a blend of emotion. And then they can become aware of blends of emotions. But on the most basic level, shame is, I am bad. Mm-hmm. Well, that doesn't leave a lot of room for moral growth. Right. We're in the original sin territory here. It's like, so what? What do I do? Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm a bad person. Okay. So as we develop more capacity, we can feel the shame, feel it. We can acknowledge it. I am ashamed. We can act on it. And one way of acting on it is going, there's a value that I violated. What was it? Well, if it's a value that I care about, I should follow it. Okay. And if I screwed something up, make amends. Okay? These are both actions. The decisions are actions, and then the actual behavior is actions. And then when I do that action, then I need to let go and move on to the next thing. Now, this is where integral comes in. Telling yourself to not think about something usually doesn't work very well, as most of us have discovered in the process of don't think about it. Good luck with that. Yeah. What does work is directing our attention to something else. And I make this point endlessly in my book, Integral Mindfulness, that compassionate self-awareness is necessary but not sufficient for development. It's necessary because you need to observe yourself with acceptance and caring intent, whether you're feeling ashamed or joyful. Okay, so fine, then if it's shame, then I can find the value, follow it, refine it, make amends if possible, learn from it, and move forward. As I do that, I'm turning shame into the regret. And regret is, I wish I knew then what I know now. I would have done it differently. And in the future, I intend to do it differently given my new understanding. So what regret does is it fits in with a more positive autobiographical narrative of us gradually learning from our mistakes and becoming a more virtuous people over time. And in my book, The Gift of Shame, the point that I made is as you do this, increasingly shame becomes a spiritual guide. If you feel guilty because you didn't meditate today, that's shame emotion, guilt. And then you meditate, your unconscious is using shame to guide you on your spiritual path.
Right.
If I feel guilty because I wasn't friendly enough with my wife, because I was distracted, and then I go and get real friendly with her and see her relax and open up as she does when I'm actively loving her. Shame has become an interpersonal spiritual guide for me to create more love.
So my wife sees through me every single time that happens.
Well,
You're
good.
being nice to me because you feel bad.
Yeah, right. But I'm also being nice to you because I feel bad because you're great and you deserve me
That's,
being nice all the time.
that's what I say.
Is one of my favorite things that I tell Becky when she says, "Are you mad?" Because we have a history of me periodically getting mad at her. I mean, I'm not much of a dick, but I've been a dick in the past. She goes, "Are you mad?" I go, "Yeah, but remember, when I'm mad at you, it's not your problem. It's my problem. You're always fine. Okay, if I'm mad, my problem, not your problem." She relaxes. I think that's a good rule of thumb, and I use that a fair amount when I'm working.
That's some good judo right there. I like that.
Yeah, and it's heartfelt. Now, one of the difficult things about this is that we develop multiple moral systems that include and transcend each other. So we have an awful lot of values in us that we can violate. We got a magical literally a physiological moral system that we're born with. We're born frightened of the dark, frightened of heights, frightened of snakes. Okay, so snakes are bad. That's a physiological moral system. Then we get a magical one. Then we get a mythic one. Then we get a rational one, a pluralistic one, and finally an integral one. Okay. So all these things are operating, and so when sometimes I might violate a magic moral system. I might break a mirror. Okay. Oh no, you have 7 years of bad luck. You're being bad. And I went, wait a minute. I'm violating the value of not breaking a mirror, and that's kind of stupid. I'm going to refine that value too. That's I don't know where that came from, but don't really believe that the universe is paying attention to whether keeps breaking mirrors or not. And that sense of distress is gone. My unconscious now has grown a little bit. Okay, but then there's also your mythic moral system. God damn it! Oh no, I used the Lord's name in vain. So I look at that and I go, well, that's not a bad standard. Because, if someone's around who'd be offended, I don't want to gratuitously offend people. I was giving these lectures at the Unitarian Church, and one guy came up to me after. He says, people have asked me to talk to you about, the F-bomb that you drop when you teach. And I go, yeah, it's such an easy laugh when it's just, if you're a public speaker, and you want to get people relaxed. And I went, good point. I felt a little guilty when he said it, and made a heroic effort after that to not drop F-bombs when I was giving those lectures at the Unity Church, and did a lot better. Not perfectly, but that's mythic. Okay, there's a mythic moral system. There's rational moral systems. There's pluralistic moral systems. A rational moral system is it is shameful to lose. Okay, I lost. I'm ashamed. Why? The value is you're supposed to win. There's victory. As Pat Riley once said, there's victory in misery. Part of his misery is he felt bad about himself, ashamed when he lost. Okay, well I want to refine that rule. I want to refine it to it feels better to win than to lose, but losing is fine, especially if I can learn something from it. And so that particular moral standard has changed over the years. And I know it's changed because my unconscious has changed. So when I make a mistake or when I lose at something, I don't feel bad in the same way that I would have felt 50 years ago. I go, yeah, it's better to be successful. It's better to win. And, I learned something this time to move on. There's a pluralistic moral system. You see this a lot with people feeling guilty about being secure.
Yeah.
I get this with a lot of my green clients. I feel ashamed that there's people in Somalia starving and I'm sitting here trying to not eat as much. And there's people being oppressed in Russia. And much as you get pissed off at the government, we do not have an East German regime here. Okay. Even if Trump and all his friends are in charge, it's the secret police are rarely going to be kicking down people's houses, and you have civil liberties and rights as well. And so having to address that as well, so it's good to feel distress for the world's suffering, and it's also good to be grateful for what I've got and to use whatever power I have to make things better. Okay, now you're moving forward. And integral mindfulness, the point that I made is this is where integral really helps us. Okay, so when it's time to let go and move on, so what is the next step for me? And the next step for me is body, mind, spirit, and self, culture, and nature.
Yeah.
It's integral life practice. It informs every moment of our existence. Now, it doesn't have to. We do 40 to 60% of what we do on habit, but those can be either good habits or bad habits.
Yep.
And we can be guilty about a bad habit. But then what does that guilt tell us? It's a bad habit. I want to have a good habit. And so then the next step, of course, is what's a good habit? And now let's use the knowledge that has been accumulated over the decades about creating good habits. By the way, if you want to create a good habit, read the book Tiny Habits. Come on, Keith, what's his name? The guy who wrote it, Hobb. He's this guy that he has got developing new habits. He's got it down the way Fritz Perls had the empty chair technique down. And so
was it BJ Fogg?
BJ Fogg, that's right. There you got it. BJ Fogg.
Good name.
It is a good name. He's a funny guy. And he's right on. He's one of those Stanford professor people. And so integral points us to these kinds of places. And then that's where we put our attention. And then if we're putting our attention into the right mode, what happens? We enter a flow state.
Mm-hmm.
And that the flow state is our emotions and our unconscious telling us we're in a groove that's a virtuous groove for us. And what happens in flow states? People feel good, they're self-reinforcing, other things disappear, you get a lot done. It's pretty great. Flow states are pretty great. Now, sometimes you get in a flow state doing something wrong, and then you'll feel a little guilty about it. Now, if you pay attention to that guilt or a little ashamed of it, you pay attention to that guilt and shame, you do that feel, acknowledge, act on, let go thing, then you refine that value and become a little bit more virtuous. Now, the converse is true also. When we were developing our defenses against shame as 14 and 15 and 16-month-old kids, we developed a lot of ways to avoid having to feel shame. For instance, I didn't do it, you did it. Projection, or I didn't do anything. Denial, or I'm going to go kick the dog, because you get mad when you're ashamed. In fact, the nervous system regulates shame into humiliation and then into rage. I might attack myself, self-mutilate, for instance. Okay. Projective identification. I'm going to take the part of me I'm ashamed of, project it onto you. And as long as I'm attacking that in you, I'm not paying attention to it in me. Or just pure dissociation. What do you feel in your body? Nothing.
Right.
Okay, all these defenses against shame are practiced by people until they're able to self-observe them. And you can't really do that in a satisfactory way until you're formal operational. I mean, you can from a concrete operational place, but it's more difficult. You got to use more metaphors with children. You can get more direct with adolescents. By the time you hit adolescence, those defenses have been practiced a lot. And every time you indulge a defense, every time you let yourself deny or project or dissociate or projective identify and attack somebody, sadistically attack when you're angry. That's not fun sadism. That's the bad kind. When you allow yourself to do that, you strengthen that and you push down the value. Okay? And after a while, you stop feeling it. And that's pathological narcissism. When you just literally can't feel it anymore. Mm-hmm. And this is where in all the creation myths and all the mythologies of all the peoples, there are always myths of somebody that has violated a standard so much that they can't come back. They've lost their soul. And this is the unconscious, the collective unconscious addressing this dynamic. And it's important. So what do we want to do? We want to turn shame into regret and then move forward. Now, why is this so hard? Well, shame really isn't the problem. The problem moving forward is self-aware consciousness and human negativity bias. I mean, that's the problem. And briefly, this is why it's the problem. Okay? A couple 100,000 years ago, there was a mutation on 2 sites of 715 sites of the FOXP2 gene that gave us the capacity to tell stories. Gave us the capacity for grammar, I, you, me, us, in the past, present, and future. Gave us the capacity for metaphor. Gave us the capacity not just to tell the story, but to hold that story in consciousness. A chimpanzee can go maybe a half hour into the future. We can go to the end of time or to the beginning of time. And so people developed this superpower of being able to have a story that they kept going with self-aware consciousness and focus. And our unconscious is constantly feeding us stories. Now, with animals, they don't have the self-aware narrative in between. There is the experience, there's the feeling and the impulse, there's the act, there's the consequence of it that positively or negatively reinforces it, and then there's moving on to the next thing. With us, we have the story that comes up with the feeling, it comes up with the action impulse. And if the story is a negative story about somebody else or about us, there's a part of us that feels like we're doing something about it if we stay on it. Our capacity for obsessive compulsive activity, and particularly obsessive thought. And so you take a human being with a negative story that they're obsessively focusing on because they feel like they're doing something about it. And all of a sudden now you have toxic shame because you can keep yourself ashamed and you can keep digging into it and you keep elaborating on the story. Just like with rage, you get really pissed off, you can elaborate a rage story till it gets bigger and bigger until the impulses get more and more destructive. And this is where a lot of murders that come out of premeditation. Mm-hmm. Love triangles especially, which are about 25% of the murders in this country. Somebody's sitting obsessing about one of the other 2 people in that triangle, and then bam, somebody gets killed. It's like that. And so that capacity to tell that story, that tendency to obsess about stuff, to try to figure it out. And then we're biased towards the negative because all our ancestors, the ones that were the most paranoid, the ones that worried the most about fitting in, the ones that got the most ashamed when they weren't fitting in, when they weren't doing what the culture wanted, the ones that thought, no, that stick's a snake, I'm going to stay away from it, they lived longer and produced more children.
Right.
So, thank you, ancestors, for making me alive. But, I really don't appreciate the fact that punishments work better on me than rewards. That takes about one negative can cancel out, a dozen positives. And that when somebody looks at me cross-eyed, there's a part of me that goes, well, they must not like me. And let me come up with a story that explains exactly why they don't like me.
It's sort of the irony, right? Is that all of those neuroses back then, actually served the survival of the species. But now here we are tens, hundreds of thousands of years later, when a lot of those neuroses have become obsolete, but we've all inherited them. Right?
That's right. We've inherited all of them. It's include and transcend. Yep. We have reflexes that were there with the very first life, single-celled life on this planet, and we still have those reflexes that we're dealing with. And I mean, this is a whole nother conversation, but this is why my Fred Provenza's book, Nourishment, was so exciting to me. That there's so many sense organs that humans and plants and everybody has that are informing our unconscious all the time. And so what we want to do then is to have an integral understanding of I want to move forward serving the highest good, which means supporting my evolution and your evolution. And that I need to be aware of all the negativity bias in me and in others. I need to be aware of my good habits and my bad habits. I need to be aware all emotions are important, but there's a tendency to amplify the negative ones, self-amplify them. And then I need to have things to do, feel like, acknowledge, act on, and things to do to deal with that. And then an understanding of my life enough to move forward into something else and let go. And this is very challenging.
Yeah.
And it happens very much relationally. And this is kind of the thing about shame that is, to me, one of the most beautiful parts of it. It's people, the way that people are socially, interpersonally, is just amazing to me. Human love is an amazing thing to me, on every level. And one of the core necessary ingredients of human love are the shame emotions. And they're there as a counterbalancing force to all the attraction emotions. And I want this, and I want you, and I want that, and I want me, and I want you, that. Okay. And that's true for everything in the universe. For one force, there's a corresponding force that keeps it in balance. But with self-aware consciousness, we can get out of balance. So one way of getting back into balance is to pay attention to shame, take it seriously, turn it into regret, and then move forward.
Right.
And that's turning shame into regret.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And I've got a bunch of notes I was taking while you were talking, Keith. I mean, it seems like cultivating this healthy relationship with shame and regret is becoming increasingly important to us today as we figure out how to navigate our cultural and informational terrain. And the reason for that is we are, almost every experience of our lives, especially now in social media land, is all of our experiences are being mediated, and often being mediated through other people's sense of shame. Because as you were talking about, every one of these developmental stages creates its own field of shame. There is a red shame, there's an amber shame, there's an orange shame, there's a green shame, teal, turquoise, etc. And in fact, we could, probably best describe our culture wars as sort of the friction that's generated between these sort of tectonic plates of different standards of shame, right? And so in that sense,
absolutely.
In that sense, shame really can act both as a floor or a ceiling for our behavior. I mean, in terms of shame being a floor, I mean, it enforces sort of, these are the behaviors that we find minimally acceptable, right? We expect you to be at this bar or above. That's shame as a bar. I think of like, the Republican Party in like the 60s and 70s, sort of the William F. Buckley Jr. version of the GOP, where one of their big concerns as postmodernism was really gaining a lot of traction was what they called the coarsening of the culture.
Yeah, right.
One of their big concerns was that their floor of shame was getting eroded, and culture was therefore becoming more coarse as a result.
Which, by the way, reflected on a cultural level, projection and projective identification. Because what was happening really for them was their standards were coarsening as they were bringing in consultants, and as they were having presidents who did dirty tricks and so on.
Oh, I think that's true. I think that's true too. I think that's definitely true. And we can also see, it's kind of ironic that the same GOP that was so worried about the coarsening of culture ended up nominating Donald Trump, who a lot of people enact as being one of the most coarse influences.
And that's my point.
Into our politics in a very long time. But I do, when I take that, again, when I take that 1960s, 1970s kind of perspective, I can see it. I can understand why the idea of a bunch of sort of impulsive, dirty hippies, right, was sort of running counter to, we're running counter to sort of the clean, orderly, kind of hygienic standards that were trying to be established by, really a predominantly amber to orange culture at the time. So I can understand it. But at the same time, that shame, so there we see shame acting as a floor, it can also act as a ceiling. And we see the same thing in the same time. I think of, I just made this page on Integral Life. I sent out an email about it a couple of days ago, where I look at every major stage of development and offer film clips and video games, actually. That's
great. That's great.
Yeah, and I'll send you a copy afterwards, Keith. I think
I'd like to see.
I'd be curious to see how much you align with it. And one of the movies I was going to use, but I didn't for whatever reason, was Pleasantville. If you've ever seen Pleasantville, it
Yeah.
was the film that took place in like the 1950s, I think. Everything was black and white. And it was basically sort of a metaphor for the emergence of post-conventional views, values, ways of being, etc., as sort of new artistic expressions start kind of coming in through the cracks, and this black and white world is resisting sort of the transformation into color, right? The color was being used as sort of symbolic for these new kind of trans
and sex,
yeah,
and laughter, and violence.
Right. That's right. All of that came with it. That's right.
Yeah.
All of that came with it. But there you can actually see Shame acting as a ceiling. It was prohibiting new kinds of novelty, new kinds of self-expression from emerging because they were too concerned about what it would do at, sort of at the bottom of society. So
That's
it's
right.
interesting that shame can sort of, we're always kind of either bumping our head against someone else's shame, or we're standing kind of on the shoulders of another group's version of shame. And us being able to cultivate this healthy relationship seems absolutely essential for us to make our way through these culture wars. Otherwise, we are internalizing other people's standards of shame. Like, for example, the woke movement right now, one of the big things the woke movement is really pushing towards is, they see it as appropriate that all white people, particularly white men, feel an intrinsic shame for the history of our ethnicity, right? There's an expectation of shame. And there's a lot of people who are, rejecting that, who are really pushing against the idea that like, I need to feel this inborn shame. So here's a type of shame that's rubbing against these other standards of shame. And again, this is how we get culture wars.
Well, yes. Jeff and I are going to be talking about a book called The Power of Bad by one of my favorite writers, Roy Baumeister and John Tierney. And they make some very interesting points about this. One thing the point that they make, they call it the crisis, that a consequence of the social media, multiple stations, all that kind of stuff, is that crisis draws attention, and it makes you more noteworthy. It makes you more popular. Making extreme crisis kind of statements is very popular. If you look at actual data about what people think, say in the United States, most people are moderates. Most people have actually, to this day, they really haven't gotten more polarized. What has gotten polarized is the political class. The reason the political class has gotten polarized is because the money class has realized that to be able to extract what they need to do is they need to have the political class. They need to control the political class, and to control the political class, they do all the things that they do, and the outlets, all these different outlets have this crisis consciousness, keeping people distressed enough to buy stuff and to vote for the political class, where it really works for at least one of the groups, the Republican group. It really works for them for nothing to happen. We want as little change as possible so that the oligarchy can extract as much as they can and give as little as possible. Okay? And everybody always gets pissed at the Democrats, me included, Ken most famously, because rather than understand that part of their work needs to be working with this particular dynamic, and there's actual social principles for dealing with people high on social dominance orientation, right-wing authoritarianism. They keep ignoring those principles and keep on dealing with each other and with other people from these ideological stances that render them impotent. And so it just leaves us all tearing whatever little hair we have left.
Yeah.
And yet, if you take the whole country, all the people that aren't in the political class, pretty much on the same page around most things. Now, and the conclusion that Baumeister and Tierney had in their book made me laugh, because I remember Ken talking about this once. He said, well, somebody said, well, what's the answer to people not being able to see fake news? Ken said, waking up. Wake up. What's the answer to people not being able to do the things for themselves that are clearly in their best interest? Ken said, wake up. Mm-hmm. And so when we finally got to that part of the book, basically Tierney and Baumeister said the same thing. They said, well, you got to activate, but now they talked like psychologists, you got to activate your frontal cortex and use it to have discerning awareness. In other words, you got to wake up. And as you wake up to shame, what you end up doing is you end up embracing it, but not indulging it.
Right.
And that's what you do with all extreme emotions.
Right.
Now, one of the things you were mentioning, it's interesting how you mentioned the ceiling and the floor. Well, this is what neuroscience has told us about social engagement. Okay. There's a certain level of arousal where we can be socially engaged. Okay. The window of tolerance around emotion. And if we don't stay in that, we really can't relate comfortably with other people. And relating comfortably with other people is the most important thing, being a human.
Right.
And this is the danger with shame. When you're ashamed or you look down and you blush and that kind of stuff, subjectively, you feel excluded from the group, okay? Which on a genetic level is experienced as approaching death.
Right.
And so there's a huge interior force to deal with that. Now, you can either deal with it with the defenses, or you can deal with it by this feel, acknowledge, act on, let go process.
Yep.
You can also deal with it by finding somebody credible to forgive you. Enter the confessional. And so if you have a cultural dynamic where you can reveal your shameful experience and have somebody credible say, yeah, but God still loves you and I forgive you, and all you got to do is pray, or all you got to do is give me some money, or all you got to do is do 10 Hail Marys or something, that gives temporary relief. Now, temporary relief isn't the greatest thing in the world, because it's hard. There's a famous saying in addiction: it's hard to get enough of something that almost works. Okay. Well, temporary relief almost works. Doesn't quite work. Unless we're developing our own moral compass, where basically we can what we can do is we can take our moral decisions and we can bounce them off our wise self. Yeah. And then our wise self becomes ultimately our guide. As we do that, then we can actually have enough. We can feel like virtuous people, even if we make a mistake. We're not caught up in a system where we are denied that capacity. Now, so you add that capacity to any of the great world's religions they're all kind of based in amber. You really need to have forgiveness from the priest, essentially, or the mullah or something. If you add that, then now you're dealing with progressive Christianity and progressive Buddhism and progressive Islam, and it's like Ken with the escalator, that's it, at that particular point. Now shame is being used as a spiritual guide, and you do it by turning shame into regret, but then also using it as a guide that helps guide me to where my values are. My values lead me to more refined values, and it's particularly that's true in a relationship. Right. And a couple working with those dynamics on a daily basis generally are very gentle with each other. They're aware that disapprovals and criticism and so on register quite loudly, and they don't do them unnecessarily. And when they do them, they do them in a very kind fashion. Right. And this is what makes for good relationships. This is what makes for good groups. And that's a big deal.
Yeah, I totally. What I'm sort of feeling into right now, Keith, is how shame seems to be this gateway that links the individual and the collective. Mm-hmm. So shame can sort of start out, if we want to just pick an arbitrary place to start the story. We can describe shame as sort of starting out as a zone 4. It's the outside of the lower left, right?
Okay.
Shame is sort of what is setting the standards and sort of the permissions for what kinds of conversations are allowed in a given group or culture or what have you. And that's, again, reinforced by this sort of shared sense of shame. If you go outside, if you transgress, if you go, push too hard. Look at the Dave Chappelle sort of uproar that's happened.
Isn't that amazing what's happened with that?
Stand-up comics make their living standing in zone 4 and figuring out where that line is. How far can we push this line until I get the shame response coming back at me, right? I mean, this is in a sense why we have stand-up comedy as an art form. These guys are actually showing us the shape of our culture and how quickly it can change from year to year, decade to decade, etc. Which is why.
And by the way, this is the history of the Joker. This is the history of the court Joker. It goes back. There were articles being written in 1920 about comedians making fun of stuff being morally wrong, and other people saying, I guess we're not going to have comedians anymore if we can't make fun of stuff.
Right.
This is 1920. These articles were happening.
That's right. And we're seeing how that, our appreciation of comedy is constantly changing, as it should be, and it requires a few canaries in the coal mine, right? Like Dave Chappelle, to know when we've hit a third rail, when we actually get to a point where it's like, oh, okay, culture's kind of, resisting that. But that's all zone 4 stuff. And it's helping sort of guide the kinds of conversations and relationships we can have in zone 3, which is the inside of the lower left. And when we step past that boundary, right? When we transgress, when that shame then is sort of, we feel it coming at us like a freight train, right? What then happens is we sort of, we have a zone 1 phenomenological experience of, I feel ashamed, right? So shame just hit me. Now I'm kind of internalizing it. I'm feeling a strong feeling of ashamed with all the upper right correlates that you say, the skin flushes, blood, our blood pressure changes, etc. Breath change. Yep, that's right. But all of this is largely landing as a phenomenological experience, and we're like, cringe, right? Now, right there, we have an opportunity to deal with it. There's certain, and you talked about like how if we can apply just a little bit of grace, just a little bit of even sort of forgiveness. I think forgiveness practice can help us transmute that feeling of shame into a feeling of regret. If we don't do that, then we can internalize that shame. It doesn't have anywhere to go, and it becomes a shadow. It becomes a zone 2 shadow for us, right? And then it just starts wreaking havoc from the basement, and it can be hard to get to unless we come into relationship with someone like yourself who can kind of guide us through the tumultuous territory of our own minds and uncover some of that repressed shame. But it's interesting how we see it moving from these multiple zones, right? Internalized. And then that internalized shame can then get projected out again as another set of sort of zone 4 standards. And I think the reason why this is important, Keith, is that, as you say, shame can be a tool or it can be a weapon. And I think that shame has a really, really important place on the table when we're thinking of like, geez, look at all these social maladies that we're trying to deal with, all these wicked problems that have sort of these multivalent, multidimensional factors to. Well, guess what? Shame is a valid sort of intervention for certain kinds of those problems, but not for all of those kinds of problems. Shame, for example, might not be the most effective strategy when we're combating something like, let's say, white privilege or majority privilege, which is largely a zone 7, the inside of the lower right phenomenon. Well, we might need a different intervention there, and shame, in fact, can kind of has the risk of making things a little bit worse. So all of which is to say, these are all valid interventions that can be used, I think, in very deliberate and skillful ways, as long as we kind of are teasing this apart and we know what goes where and where, where the causal sort of sources of these challenges are coming from in the first place. And shame is a fascinating one because I see it kind of ping-ponging from zone to zone to zone to zone.
Absolutely. And it's, as of everything, it's there in all the zones.
Right.
And again, you notice you're making a case for waking up.
Right.
Which is now one problem with Integral has always been Integral gives such a wide vision if you, particularly if you incorporate it in terms of observing yourself as well as other people, it puts a lot of pressure on, all right, in my current cultural context, where are the boundaries? Okay. It's relaxing to be around people where you don't have to make that discernment, which goes back to Sangha, which goes back to what we were talking about with Terry.
Right.
Where, all right, it kind of, I'm thinking about Terry and Diane and Jeff and I sitting around. There really wasn't anything forbidden any one of us could have said about anything in that particular moment. Now, in other cultural contexts, actually, there are lots of things that might be forbidden. And the person with the deepest consciousness has the most responsibility.
Yeah.
So if I inadvertently start swearing when I'm giving my lecture at the Unity Church, that's on me. And I like feeling a little ashamed of that. And then I like going, okay, Keith, let's change the value that you have from, being this free-spirited person to being a free-spirited person who doesn't unnecessarily offend somebody when you're giving a lecture in a chapel, for Christ's sake. Oh, I just did it again.
About knowing your audience. I mean,
knowing your audience.
Example. I love that example, Keith, because like I was just saying, I have that page of film clips associated with every stage. One of the film clips I chose for Teal is a very graphically, it uses a lot of offensive language, right?
Oh.
It uses really, really crass language. Now, I actually saw this. I was like, okay, I am feeling sort of a transgression of a certain kind of shame just by putting this clip on the page. And in fact, I think we can use that as a leverage point. It's almost like, I've often kind of joked around. It's almost like an integral gargoyle that's here to scare off all the new age kind of greeny riffraff. Like if you're offended by something
new
like
age greeny riffraff,
if you're offended
Corey,
like this,
that's a little bit dismissive.
Maybe, well, that was kind of, that was sort of I was having fun with shame.
Yeah, okay.
By using that clip.
Well, now, are there any questions? Does anybody want to ask any questions about this?
Yeah, so let's give the spiel. If you're here in Zoom with us, you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll turn on your camera, have some real-time back and forth, or you can hit the Q&A button, submit a written question. For you guys watching us right now on YouTube, you can just type in a comment on the wall. If I see it, I will pull it in. Let me take a look real quick. Let's see. One person says, rest in peace, Terry. They're still looking into the section on shadow work regularly from the ILP book. I would say of all chapters of the ILP book, shadow is probably the one that most of us return to over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, to me, that's part of the reason I wrote Shadow Light. It's necessary.
Yeah.
And sometimes sufficient. Sometimes working on shadow is necessary and sufficient for supporting your ontological evolution and the evolution of a relationship. It's a big deal.
Yep. Arthur Sutherland says, I learned to use gargoyle filters when dating. I love that.
well done.
And that's what humor is. I think that's why, especially when we get to know someone for the first time, one of the first things we want to do is show them our sense of humor. That's because right. Humor, I think, is what sort of illuminates the boundaries of our shame, right? When we actually sit here and can we agree on what's funny versus what's not funny? That sort of, you create a resonance just by sharing a sense of humor. And if the person you're with shares your humor, so you might be using some, again, deliberately crass or what have you, jokes just to kind of, I'm kind of poking at the margins here. I kind of want to know how far your boundary, you know what I mean? How far it can go and how much it intersects with mine. So I think a gargoyle filter for dating is a really good idea.
Freud called humor the most mature defense, the most sophisticated defense. Well, and indeed, particularly in the right frontal cortex, there's just an awful lot of territory there devoted to the higher functions. Intuition's one of them, humor is one of them, insight, empathy. These require more of our brain than other capacities because they're more complex. And also it's very revealing to see what you find funny, but also what you find embarrassing. And you find that the line between embarrassment, shame, emotion, and funny This very, very fine line.
Yes. Keith, this is why shows like The Office got as popular as they did. It was known as cringe humor. It was kind of like, oh, I'm watching these people embarrass themselves and it makes me kind of cringe, but that's funny. You know what I mean? It's like a safe way to feel shame in a certain kind.
Watch the first Ace Ventura movie. First Ace Ventura movie. It's full of scenes where there's a bunch of people and he is going on doing something incredibly opposite, bad.
Yeah.
I mean, bad. And they're watching with just horror as he does whatever he's doing. And that causes us to laugh. Now, the interesting thing about laughter is one of the theories of humor is that we see something that shifts our perspective suddenly. There's a sudden energy shift, and the human response to those sudden energy shifts is laughter. That's one theory of humor, and I think that's accurate. But one other thing about humor that I find fascinating is that when you measure a long-time Tibetan Buddhist meditator when they're meditating, energetically, pretty much all the frequencies are lighting up simultaneously. That doesn't happen with other people except when they're lost in laughter.
Oh, wow.
And it's the same signature, the same EKG signature, which I went,
No, and it's
very, very interesting.
Yeah. And especially if you're in a group of people and you're all just losing it laughing, there is a dropping of identity. It's like there's its own shared body mind dropped. And
That's
in
right.
that space, we are kind of all co-inhabiting this field, whatever it might be, right? And it's liberating. There's something that is released. I mean, humor has such radical implications in all four quadrants. I mean, it's amazing how much of our society, our civilization, we have built around our sense of humor.
Well, yeah, and who's the 19th century author that's the most widely quoted author to my knowledge? Well, I'd say Mark Twain.
Mark Twain, yeah.
Who's just couldn't write a paragraph without saying something funny.
Yep.
So anyway, there's shame into regret. There's the ontological necessity of shame, and the social necessity of shame, and using shame as a gift, the gift of shame, eventually becoming a spiritual guide. There it is.
Love it. Keith, thank you as always, man. This has been such as always, this has given me just a lot to think about. I feel like every show, when we do these shows, it's always landing for me personally in a big way. Like there's always immediate takeaways. So it's going to be really interesting to spend the next few weeks until you and I get together again, just kind of unpacking this in my own life. And I'm sure our audience at home will be too. And we want to hear from you guys. Let us know what you think of this discussion down below. Let us know what challenges you have encountered as you have grappled with the feelings of shame and regret. How have you, what strategies have you found that helps release that? How have you been able to use your shame and regret as a leverage point for your own growth and development and awakening and cleaning up and showing up and all of that? We would love to hear from you guys. Let us know in the comments right down there. In the meantime, Keith, I love you, baby.
I love you, Corey. Much love to everybody.
Yeah. All right. Until next time. See ya.
The next time. Bye-bye.